Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Reed. I'm a faculty member in print and digital news and teach at the Missouri and have been part of BOATS for 4 years. And this morning we're talking about Ferguson. No recent news story has better illustrated the power of images and social media to influence opinion and move people to action than Ferguson. What began as a local story quickly became national then international news as people in Ferguson used Twitter and Vine and Reddit to tell each other in the world what had happened to Mike Brown. The story went viral, and it wasn't just about the 90 seconds of fatal interaction between Mike Brown and Darren Wilson, or about the hours that Brown's body lay in the street. It blew the lid off tensions between police and the people they're sworn to serve and protect, and exposed the fraught relationship between black communities and white-dominated government institutions, like the police department in Ferguson, like others all over the country. The story tapped deeply into an undercurrent of anger and frustration toward a criminal justice system that seems stacked against black people, especially young black men. It revealed to citizens how militarized even small-town police departments have become with the help of the federal government. It validated different things for different people. For people raised with a fear of law enforcement and frustration with being targeted day after day, what happened in Ferguson was more of the same and the last straw. For others, Ferguson was just more evidence that black men need suppressing, and thank God for the police. What people thought about what happened to Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Eric Garner and Rodney King depends on a multitude of factors. Sometimes watching on Twitter, it looked like a national consciousness raising about race in America, or as if nothing ever changes. Citizen journalists, especially live streamers, people working for new media or companies, mainstream media organizations, anyone with a smartphone, contributed to providing hundreds of perspectives. Some news organizations tried to create context for the chaos, barely able to keep up with the speed and the intensity of the news. So perhaps it's now up to documentary filmmakers to bring together not just the what happened and the why, but even more important, the what now. So let me introduce our panel. John arrives just in the nick of time, fresh from Ferguson, Missouri. Let me start here with Miriam Bale, who is a freelance writer who's written for the New York Times, the Daily News, IndieWire, Sight and Sound, Film Comment, and many other outlets. She is also a film programmer and has organized film series and festivals, has a background in documentary film production, and is working on a book about black film in the age of Obama. John Eligon has been a reporter for the New York Times for 10 years and is currently stationed in Kansas City, covering 6 states in the Midwest. He writes on a variety of topics, from politics to urban issues to rural life. He is a graduate of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and John covered Ferguson extensively. Alicia Sperry is a reporter at Vice News, where she has covered a variety of social justice issues, including policing, criminal justice, labor, and immigration. She was one of the first national reporters on the front lines of the Ferguson protests and has returned to Missouri several times since then, and has covered the movement for police accountability as it has spread across the country. And on the end is Goldie Taylor, a veteran journalist, opinion writer, and cable news contributor. She's worked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, for MSNBC as a political analyst, and in recent years has written dozens of guest op-ed columns for The Daily Beast, Salon, Essence, AJC, Creative Loafing, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It's a long list, Goldie. Goldie grew up in East St. Louis, went to school in Ferguson and St. Anne, and moved around the greater St. Louis area. Her film 89 Blocks about East St. Louis is in post-production. She also spent some time in Ferguson last year. So let's begin with a Vice video. Bring us all back right away.
shot.
Today's Monday evening. This is the first night that the National Guard has arrived in Ferguson. Press journalism!
Hey, let's get going.
Down here. So they won't talk to us. They told us to go back to the beginning of the line.
Keep going.
Can you tell me what you've seen tonight? It would help everyone understand why you guys are doing it.
They'll talk to you up there, ma'am.
A lot of people here are telling us they're constantly harassed by police. They're pulled over for any reason, given tickets for any reason or no reasons, and they're just tired and frustrated. Do you see that, or do you agree with it?
No, I don't see it, but people that I've talked to have been supportive and appreciative of our work and trying to protect them and save them.
We're not getting arrested, we're getting a ride from police officers, and we're going back to police headquarters. Just saw a guy that looked like he had been cuffed get into this van over here, and we're now seeing another guy who's shirtless, wearing just shorts, and police are searching him.
I need you to shut your camera off, ma'am. We're going to go through here. All right, go ahead and shut your camera off because you can't be filming this, okay?
Just put it down.
Yeah, I'm going to escort him up here. Go ahead and put your camera down or shut it off for me, ma'am. All right, that's per my command.
A cop just killed a guy in front of my apartment. When I seen Big Mike got shaken up, nigga had to tweet that site. If you seen that night, they ran in the QT, burned it down, West Florissant, looting, cops posted in my street, 20 niggas deep, guns pointed, and my people still gather beautifully.
Instead of getting answers, we're getting shot at. People are still getting hurt by the police.
Look at this shit. Look at this. I'm suing their ass. Who was it? City, county, the safety patrol, all of their ass.
Thursday, there was, we talked about being transparent, and people trusted that, and I meant that when I said it. And it's taken us a couple of days to get back to Thursday, and that trust.
It's not fair to the kids, to the children out here, because we're seeing what's happening in this generation. We're seeing things that we don't need to be seen.
When all this stuff happened with Mike Brown in Ferguson, how were people in this community, in this neighborhood, reacting to that?
Since the Mike Brown incident and now this incident, it's gonna be a big deal. It's gonna be big. It's gonna be big.
It was very hard to raise African American males in this community, especially with the police harassment.
We all Michael Brown, Jason. We're not just Michael Brown, it's a movement. We tired. We need to stand up.
So, Alicia and Goldie, I want you two to help provide us with a timeline of the early days of the media coverage of what was happening in Ferguson. Antonio French has talked about, Antonio French is an alderman, St. Louis alderman, was one of the first people there who was vining at the scene. Talk about what happened to those images and sort of the timeline of when the national media and then the international media started to descend.
You know, there really was a TikTok that I think most people weren't really aware of, but I saw a graph that hit Twitter that sort of crystallized it for me, that showed me the context of how social media erupted first, and then cable newsers took it on, and then print journalists sort of made their way into Ferguson. That Saturday, I guess it's around 4 o'clock Eastern time, 3 o'clock Central. I'm at home in Atlanta, and I'm on Twitter, and my family back home in Ferguson and St. Anne, they're beginning to tweet about this kid. And at the time, the news was, he's 17, 10 shots, unarmed in the back. That's the headline that I'm getting at, you know, my time in Atlanta. When I tune in, I start to see these pictures, videos, vines come in. First time I'd ever seen a vine in my life, I have to tell you. and I'm watching these short videos come out of Ferguson, and the young man is still on the ground. And there are a number of very early voices in this. I sent the first hot note, and at the time I'm working for MSNBC, but I sent the first hot note to both CNN and MSNBC around 5 o'clock Eastern time, 4 o'clock your time here. No one responded. CNN was silent. MSNBC rang in that night, says, we've got a local affiliate, local story, maybe we'll talk about it next week. They did talk about it that Sunday, but the tweets kept coming. I had a hard time shutting down my app that night because people were still talking. The rage was building, and by the time the following day on Sunday came, MSNBC ran a short package in its noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock hours, its news hours, but no one else was saying a word nationally until Sunday night. Just before sundown, you're seeing brand new vines, and by this time, Antonio French is on the ground. And we're sending, his vines are starting to get into newsrooms around the country. And I say to MSNBC, we got to talk to this guy. He's not from Ferguson, drawing the lines. By the time sundown was coming in St. Louis, and you're starting to see what these vines are looking like, that the crowd is young, the crowd is agitated. There's no leadership, no activist leadership on the ground. The NAACP is nowhere to be found. Things are about to pop off. So my third hot note goes in. I know we've got a local affiliate, but we need to have better eyes on the ground. Unrest is coming. MSNBC would not send anyone. So I got the NAACP and a local business leader to fly me into St. Louis Monday morning. And I became the first national reporter on the ground because no one else thought it was such a great story. By Monday night, we were live.
Right. Alicia, were you there right about the same time? Did you arrive?
I actually got on Wednesday. I had to push quite a bit.
To push.
There.
Move your mic up. Right. Thanks.
I've been following this since probably about Sunday also, but we cover international news and national news when they're really big national news. We're a fairly small news organization and have very limited resources. But we have been covering protests and social movements all over the world. We kind of made a name for that kind of coverage. And so by the time Tuesday came, I was really telling my editor, there is no way we can not cover this. This is in St. Louis. It's like 2 hours away from New York. We have to be there. And so they sent me alone. And I'm actually a staff writer. I don't normally work on the video division at Vice. And then that Wednesday is actually, I think, the day that really marked a tipping point for the media. That afternoon, Wes from the Washington Post and Ryan from the Huffington Post were arrested at McDonald's, the infamous McDonald's. Yeah. Actually watched them get arrested. It was the most absurd thing ever. And then that night, Al Jazeera got tear gas while live. And so the day after, Vice sent on a whole crew. Everybody else did. It went from basically no coverage, a few national correspondents, local reporters, independent media, and then everybody. The day after, I was sitting next to Chris Hayes at a press conference. And that day, actually, it's interesting because that's when they moved control of the protests over to the Missouri Highway Patrol. And that Thursday night was actually extremely peaceful. It was tons of people out, hundreds of people. It was really a beautiful moment, actually. That's when people thought the protests might turn into something positive. It was a great night. You could see some of the national reporters perhaps a bit disappointed there was no tear gas that night. But overall, it was actually a great night. And then the Friday, so the day after that, Ferguson PD released a video with the alleged robbery, possibly incriminating Mike Brown in this robbery. And that, of course, really angered protesters. So that night, we saw again more violent protests and some looting. And of course, the day after that, the day after that, a state of emergency and a curfew were put into place. So that's kind of the timeline of the first week or so. But for me, I would say that Wednesday is really the day that put it on the map for most national media. And I think the sad thing about that is that really what I think did it is the fact that 2 journalists were arrested and then journalists were tear gassed. Because protesters have been getting arrested and getting tear gassed for the 3 days prior to that, and nobody was really paying a whole lot of attention.
John, when did you get there?
Well, my situation was a little bit different. I mean, in that that Monday I actually had to take off for a family obligation for a couple of days, so I was kind of out of the loop. One of my colleagues, by I think the Monday was the first day we had a story, so it would be Sunday night into Monday morning. My opinion on what actually got the media interested was the burning of the Quick Trip, and I think that had that not happened, then Mike Brown would just be another footnote of the long list of young black men who've been killed in St. Louis, unfortunately, and unfortunately it did take the burning of the Quick Trip to get people's attention. And yeah, so as I said, my colleague was there. I think she had come down from Chicago on Monday. I was back home on Wednesday evening, and I did I worked from home, kind of working some sources and stuff by phone while I had two of my colleagues, and we're in St. Louis, we're in Ferguson at the time. And then I eventually came down that the first night of the curfew, which I was believed to be the Saturday after it was shot, so about a week later, was the first time I was actually on the ground there.
So the local media at this point, early on, were already there, yes? Did you get a sense of surprise about what was happening in Ferguson among the local media? Because in reading the Justice Department report, you hear about problems that have been in Ferguson for a long time. And, without knowing much about, haven't had a chance to look into the depth of the reporting by the St. Louis media about the problems in Ferguson with police harassment and arrests and this revenue generating system that they had of arrests. I'm wondering what you saw of the local media early on in the coverage.
What we saw in the DOJ report yesterday has been a way of life in St. Louis since my grandparents migrated there just after the turn of the century. That there has always been what I have called an American apartheid that was enforced by law enforcement, by restrictive housing covenants, sundown towns. The social fabric of St. Louis has not evolved all that much. Local press has been aware largely of the conditions, but not reported to any significant extent over the years. This was their story to break, and they never did. And so I find us culpable as journalists in allowing this kind of condition to persist. And when the story broke open, the local reporters that I knew here on the ground, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, people at our NBC affiliate here, they were stunned that this kind of eruption was happening. My general feeling is to survive and thrive, and I grew up on Robin Smith and Max Hunter and all of these folks in St. Louis as these iconic news reporters, but to survive in those newsrooms meant that you had to buy into a certain part of the privilege paradigm. That, you didn't cover it because you didn't have to. Nobody was pressing you to get the story of the evolution of a St. Anne, Missouri. No one was pressing you to get, what was really going on in the ugly underbelly in East St. Louis. Nobody was pressing you to get those stories. And in fact, if you did bring those stories back, they did not see, really sort of the light of day. And so this story caught, in my estimation, St. Louis local press unawares. Mm-hmm. It caught them with their pants down. And while they were shuffling, trying to catch the story, they were trying to pull up one pants leg, while they're holding a camera. And, there are some great reporters in St. Louis, there really are. Oh, yeah. But this story showed the weaknesses of so many. And I think a lot of things will change in St. Louis going forward, especially after this DOJ report. But I think that the St. Louis local press has been impacted in ways that we cannot even begin to number and name today.
Mm-hmm. There was actually observable, I think, shock at the relationship between the police and the community in Ferguson, and so much of the live streaming and the video that came out of there really helped people see that. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of the battle lines in covering the story. Alicia, you've talked about the physical issue of where you stood and being sort of perceived as being part of the protesters, and sort of navigating that.
Yeah. Actually, just to get back to that point,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'll link
Yeah.
back to this,
Yeah.
but I think one of the things that surprised everybody, local press, for national press, and protesters even, was police's response. It was so unnecessary and completely outsized and just so entitled and really absurd. And I think that's what really made this story. And something I asked people many, many times when I was there is like, why is this happening now? Black men are killed by police across the country all the time. What is it this time, and why is this lasting so long, and why are people in the streets again? And I think really police made that story by responding the way they did. And for us, what really, being a national media, what really interested us was, the following days and what happened next. Of course, we have also covered the killing itself and some of what was going on in St. Louis before, but police response is really, I think, what made that story at the beginning. But to get back to your point, yes, as I mentioned, I'm a print journalist. I come from very traditional newspaper training, never been on camera before Ferguson. And I got to Ferguson that Wednesday and alone, and I just couldn't wait to go back to the hotel and write a story. There was so much going on so fast, as you mentioned earlier. I was in the middle of the suburbs, in the middle of the day, and there were cops pointing guns at kids. That Wednesday, there was tear gas in the middle of the afternoon outside of McDonald's. It was just so completely absurd and surreal, and I just started tweeting about it like everybody else had in the days before it. And I was never really big on Twitter before. I didn't really see the point of live tweeting things until Ferguson, where you had that moment of, immediate accountability. This needs to be out now as we speak. And the same thing happened with the live stream. So Vice sent a video crew a day after that, and they actually sent a correspondent that was supposed to be on air. But police started shutting down streets pretty often. So a lot of reporters couldn't actually get into the area where the protests were happening, by the Quick Trip mostly. And so one night our correspondent was shut out, he couldn't get in. I just happened to be with the producer and the live stream box, and we called up one of the protesters that we met on the street the day before and asked him for help to get into Ferguson, and we just kind of got in from the back ways. There's this soccer field, and we just snacked through the woods and made it into the scene. And she's like, okay, you've never been on camera, go now. And we live streamed for 5 hours that night. That was the first bit you saw in the clip, actually, was that night. And live stream, I think, is something that, we can say so much about it. There's so many ethical questions, so many problems with it. It kind of walks a fine line between entertainment and news, and I have many, many problems with it. But in that context, it just gave this, this immediate accountability element, and it was so important. When I walked up through the police line, all I really had was this live stream box, and I'm like, everybody else is watching, and I usually tell people I'm live streaming as a way for them to kind of respond to that. But the other point you raised about where you stand, this was again something that was very much done by the police. As soon as the state of emergency was instated, they set up these media zones, which were basically areas where the media was allowed to stay. There was a curfew for everybody else. We could be out as long as we stuck to these zones. They were usually very far from the protests, completely controlled, couldn't see anything, and there were hundreds of reporters stuck in these little corners. So we and a few others decided to just not listen to it, and those are the people that usually got arrested. And we kind of had to pick sides in a way, which is metaphorical in a sense, but we embedded with the protesters. I also happen to have a lot of sympathy for their cause, and I felt closer to their position, but it was mostly a physical choice. Am I going to be behind the police line, or am I going to be with the protesters? Where do I stand? And that's what I'm going to see. So in a way, it was very difficult to report without taking a side.
Right. John, you talked about it's a little easier when you just have a notebook and a pen. You don't have someone shouting at you, don't shoot, because that was coming from both sides. There's a lot of police saying, turn off the camera, turn off the camera.
Yeah. I mean, I was kind of chameleon-like, and when it served my interest. So generally speaking, I always had my press pass on, but I'd keep it tucked in. And generally, when you're among the protests and reporting and stuff like that, I just kind of keep it tucked in. Anytime I would want to talk to anyone, I'd identify myself as a reporter. I make sure that that's important. But other than that, I just kind of observe and whatnot. But there'd be certain situations where they everyone got to go home, and then you got to show them your press. And even when the way I look, sometimes they don't believe it. I don't know if they think I bought it from McDonald's or something like that. But there were definitely times where I would show out my press pass, and they would be like, "No, everybody's got to go." And a CNN is doing a live shot right next to me, and it's kind of weird, yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of it is. You got to be kind of agile about it in the sense that. The fact is, probably with good reason, a lot of protesters were frustrated at media by, week 2, 3, 4, whatever. And so you do have to kind of, kind of be careful how you navigate it, as where the police were frustrated by the media. So it's kind of, you got to kind of be able to work with both sides.
Miriam, you've been an observer all along of what was going on Twitter in this story.
Right. I have. I was not covering in Ferguson, so I have more questions than answers. But I'm writing a book. In part of the book that I'm writing, I've been observing changes in Black culture, and a big part of. So I also, just as a citizen, I was really paying attention to the tweets about Ferguson from the first Saturday, from hearing tweets that it was some kid got shot for stealing candy was the first tweets I heard, and these sort of different rumors, and paying attention to it, and then found myself in the role of being the main broadcaster of this information to the people in my network, who are mostly film critics. I'm not a journalist, I'm a critic, and the people in my network are arts and critic based, and a lot of them, the white ones, really, it was the first they heard of it on Tuesday and Wednesday. They had not heard anything about this because it hadn't made the coverage. It was really shocking, the difference. And so I don't want to get too far from the timeline because I've been paying attention more over time. But I think initially I had a thought of, I'm interested in what the panelists have, how they answer the question of what Alicia was just talking about which side do you fall on? Because I initially was like, oh, I'm a film critic, but this seems like this would make a really good documentary. And I really had to ask myself some questions about, but the kind of documentaries that I'm interested in are really nuanced, are these true-false documentaries, these really nuanced, balanced documentaries where no one is a hero and no one really looks good, and I would just want to ask, how many people in the audience are in the documentary program? Anyone? So not very many.
Our brand.
Your brand, yeah.
Our brand new documentary program. We're not quite off the ground yet.
Oh,
so
I see.
yeah.
So it's just getting started. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So there's people. Okay. So these questions that are often asked in this conference about the difference between journalism and documentary, and I wasn't sure. I had a side of this. I just felt like I didn't think that I could make a documentary about. I didn't think that I could make a nuanced documentary about an issue that had such a clear right side, and that's the conclusion I came to at the time. I'm not sure if that's correct. I'm still sort of asking those questions, and I'm really curious about the documentaries that will come from this. But but now looking back, I regret that decision because it was such a historical moment. Everything has changed since those initial first 2 weeks, and whether you have a site or not, just to document that moment has it's changed the language about how we speak about race and Black issues so remarkably, all from that first month and the first 2 weeks. So it was really fascinating to watch the spread of information, and even hearing on this panel to hear about the difference about whether the everything changed with the burning of the Quick Trip, I think, was some people thought, or whether it was when the police started tear gassing.
Or arresting journalists.
And arresting journalists. And I think already, or all three of those things. I feel like that there was the arresting of the journalist, and which was a flagrant, just, you know, it was just so flagrant. But that was because it was who they were attacking. The burning of the Quick Trip was the story I heard from some people being like, oh, Ferguson, all those protesters, you know, all those people are being unruly, and you still hear that. So there's almost like two stories that you hear completely. And then the other one is like, oh, this was the moment they pulled out tanks and tear gas, and America declared war on brown people, and was the feeling that a lot of people had at that moment. And it's interesting now, more so than ever, that there are two stories, I think, about what happened in Ferguson.
I think I'll say one thing about the burning of the Quick Trip. I feel like, yeah, without context, it can be taken as, oh, these unruly people burned a Quick Trip. But, you know, talking to a lot of young folks on the ground, some of them who were in there or had friends who were in there, you know, when it was being burnt down, it was kind of almost like, you know, they said to me straight up, hey, no one would care about us if we didn't do this. It was, I don't know if it was planned, but I feel like it was divine somehow. It was prepared. It was being prepared to happen.
So there was
years
almost-
of prepared this to
almost
years
an-
of frustration prepared that moment to come. You know.
And an awareness, you think, John, that it would require the destruction of property to draw the world's attention to what was happening there? Is that sort of?
I think it's just a feeling that, listen, people don't listen to us anyway, so what harm can come from us burning out a picture? You already think bad about us, so I mean, now
what's it gonna
Yeah, what's it
take?
gonna, you know, what's that gonna do to our reputation? Who cares, you know? But and I largely believe they're right. I mean, that brought all these media folks in. I mean, my personal feeling, I wish that media would have been more responsive before that. Sadly, that's not how it is. But yeah.
Yeah, I want to drill down a little bit on what you said about being pulled very hard to one side.
Yeah.
You said the same thing, Miriam, about the sense that there is one right side. That's a difficult situation for a journalist to be in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we all come, regardless of the media organization we report for, we all come from personal experiences and personal stories.
Yeah.
So we all bring our own perspective to this kind of issues anyway. And I think it's important to just recognize that going in. I feel pretty fortunate to work for a news organization that, you know, believes in fairness, but also believes in our actual mandate is calling things as we see them. And if what I see is cops pointing guns at kids, I'm going to say cops are pointing guns at kids. And I think there was a lot of fear by some of the media that came down after that Wednesday. You know, this obsession that some media still has and trying to be balanced all the time, which really doesn't make sense in a lot of situations. And I think, to be fair, I think it was very difficult to report on how police were living that moment because they weren't talking to us at all. In the video you saw, when we literally forced them to pick us up and drive us in their cars so we could try and talk to them, and they didn't. Then I also had a few encounters with Captain Johnson from Highway Patrol and tried to speak with him a few times. And we also covered Ferguson after leaving Ferguson. So I think with time and after things kind of calm down, you can try and get other perspectives in. But in the moment, it was very difficult to remain neutral, also because we were treated as everybody else. We were treated as protesters, which, you know, I don't think we should be treated any differently. If you're going to arrest people and tear gas people, then go ahead, bring tear gas me too. But I think it became very difficult for people to sort of keep their own emotions out of it. It was a very, very intense moment. I think some media did that, and the protesters were very upset that a lot of the media was extremely focused on the looting, as if that were the only thing that happened. It happened a lot, but it was by no means the story. And I think it took maybe the looting, as you said, to get the attention, but then after that, you should have gone in and talked to people and asked what brought you to this, and there wasn't so much of it, at least at the beginning. And then there was also a lot of deference to what police was saying. Like, there was one moment that first week when a few of us were getting tear gas on live stream and said it on live stream, and I got a text while getting tear gas. I got a text from my editor saying, "Are you sure it's tear gas? Because CNN is saying it's just smoke, because that's what police are saying." Like, CNN's not here. But there's this, you know, there's this attitude that journalists have. We'll just take whatever the statement says and go with it as if it were fact.
Right.
And I think one thing Ferguson taught us is police lie all the time, right? And if we didn't know that before. So I think...
Yeah, and we saw last night, those of us who saw the Central Park 5, I don't know how many people here saw the Central Park 5 last night, but I mean, we saw what deference to police and what the police say happened where it gets us.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing that I wanted to mention briefly about the DOJ report. It's very important, and for some people it validates what people have been saying, but people have been saying this for months, and maybe if the quick trip weren't burnt down, we would have never gotten to a DOJ report, and there are so many other Fergusons all over the place that will never get their DOJ report. That doesn't mean people are not out there saying the same things that are in the report and denouncing the same issues, so we should be able to listen to all of them without, like the DOJ in the past 5 years has investigated something like 20 police departments and consistently found that what people were saying about those police departments was true. So perhaps we should just, as journalists, pay attention to what people are saying just as much as what institutions and officials are saying.
And it's funny how we do have our blinders on, because, a couple of years ago, my wife and her family, they're from Alton, Illinois, which is right across the river from St. Louis. And her father, my sister-in-law lives in North County, and their father, so my father-in-law was, a couple of years ago, he was driving through, I think it was Wellston, and there was a police roadblock. They were in an unmarked vehicle, and there was, they don't have any badges or anything like that, so he said, "Can I see your ID?" When he asked the police officer, "Well, can I see your badge or something?" They pulled him out of the car, slammed him on the car, locked him up for the night, And I remember when I was so mad when that happened. I'm thinking at the time I lived in New York, so it necessarily wasn't my beat to cover that. But, and it wasn't until this came back around and happened, I'm like, oh, crap, did I have the blinders on too? It's like, like my father-in-law, a lot of times you hear stories from people like, well, he must have done something, right? You don't really know. But my father-in-law is like, he's not the kind, he's a church-going, he's not the kind of guy who would be like cursing at a police officer, let alone trying to swing on him. But they locked him up for the night. And obviously they released him the next day.
Because he politely asked for the officer's ID.
The officer's ID, took him out of the car, slammed him on there, and took him to jail for the night.
Early on, I fought the fight of trying to keep this, even though St. Louis is home for me. I fought the fight of trying to stay this objective news analyst, to see it as it, the outsider's view, and to report what I saw, how I saw it unfold, call it as you see it. But when you say as you see it involves all of your other past experiences. And so there just came a point when I realized that I couldn't throw away the other 45 years of living, that it all sort of came to a center point. Not very far away, less than 3 miles from where Michael Brown was shot dead in the street, my father was shot dead in the street. There isn't a man in my family, immediate family, who was born alive today, who was born before 1986. We are a family of women, and when you look at the kinds of things that caused their deaths, took them away from us. Murder, heart disease, sickle cell, you just got to name the pathology. So that I came to this story thinking I was going to tell one story, what's happening here and how does it move forward. I left the story saying the bigger story is, how did we get here? Who broke this and why? And so I wanted to talk more about the condition that created a situation where a young man is on the ground for 4 or 5 hours. I wanted to know what kind of condition would present itself where peaceful protesters would show up to the city hall the very next day and be met with dogs. And for those of us looking on the outside, you would say, oh, well, the dogs weren't antagonistic. They were, sort of sitting and healing. But if you're looking at this from the inside, as someone who's lived in Ferguson or lived in Pagedale or Wellston or Kinloch or some of these other places who have canine units, you know how these dogs have been used. And so the mere presence of the dog is a threat. And so reporters parachuting in don't have all of that history to deal with. And so they don't see the escalation, and thus they can't report on the escalation because they're calling it as they see it, but they really can't see it. And so I think that there is, when we talk about, based on a true story, call it as I see it, there takes so many layers to get to that thing called truth. And sometimes it's that objective outside reporter, it is that inside seer, it is the lived life. When you take all of those layers together, then a story really comes to life. And there's been such a diversity of reporting around Ferguson that it has become, I think, one of the most richly told stories because of it.
Yeah. Yep. The challenge, as a couple of you have said, is that when you were in the middle of the story as it was unfolding, it was difficult to understand it, right? And so how, when news events are breaking that quickly, how can we do a better job of giving people context and understanding? It was a tough time to access the people who could help, help the public understand why Ferguson was happening and what the underlying causes were.
I mean, from my experience, what I tried, I'd never been to St. Louis before. I knew almost nothing about St. Louis. When I got to Ferguson, in fact, my first trip, I only was in Ferguson. I didn't even make it to St. Louis except for, I think, one evening. And I think in a different situation, when things are not moving so fast, I would definitely, reach out to people and read up. And I did, sort of retroactively. You're absolutely right. I think it's so difficult to put a story in context when you're just like parachuting in and don't have that context. And in fact, I think some of the best reporting on Ferguson came in the weeks following it. I think the best early story I saw was that really long Washington Post piece on how municipalities in St. Louis County are profiting off poverty by this fine system, which we now have seen confirmed again by the DOJ report. We've seen 2 lawsuits filed against these like debtors' prisons in Ferguson and Jennings, I think. And so that story to me really put it in context in a great way. That was maybe 2 weeks in, I think.
No, that I'm gonna tell you when that story broke, because I broke that story.
All right then.
I broke that story Monday night.
Really?
After he was killed on All In with Chris Hayes on MSNBC Live, when I talked for the first time about the 90 different jurisdictions and the policing for profit. And the story was skipped. The producer never followed up, never came back around, never said, what did you mean by that? Do you really mean that these cities are being, held up, propped up by traffic citations? And I said, well, every third Thursday, just go around Bellevue Vickers in the little city hall and see who's lined up around the building to pay these fines, and people are being arrested. And if you get a parking ticket in, 2010 and you don't pay it and you don't do a no-show, and suddenly you're in for $1,500 over a parking ticket, and, people are, this has economic outcomes. And I wrote about this on my blog on Fault Lines JPS, that this has economic outcomes, that people lose jobs over jail time. 3 days in jail, I could lose my hourly job. It has extraordinary car insurance, cost. And if I'm not able to work and not able to get my kids to school, it has economic costs for my children and public health. And so this is more than just about a $50 traffic ticket. And so that's when the story started. It got picked up a couple weeks later. Washington Post did an extraordinary piece. St. Louis Post-Dispatch came out with a full cover of what these police departments really looked like in terms of diversity, because another piece of this was, people from Chesterfield policing people in Ferguson, and why is that? And so that's when the story broke, but we were so caught up in this game that we missed it. And so I kept talking about it, and kept talking about it. I'm still talking about it on Twitter now, this morning. And so now it is the biggest story there is. I was so afraid, even after the Washington Post story, that we would miss it, that Eric Holder came to Atlanta to do a speech where I lived, that's a month or so ago, I don't know how long ago it was now. He came to give a speech, and I was on the docket to speak that night. And as he came in, I sat down and rewrote my entire speech around this issue. That if you're going to investigate anything at all, investigate policing for profit. And I don't know if he's mad at me that night or not. I don't know. He said he liked me before the speech. I don't think he, I haven't really heard from him since. I don't think I'm welcome at the Justice Department today after the speech. But that's been the thing. And so I appreciate that the DOJ's got a report out. The Washington Post has done a report, but that story was early surfaced, and it got ignored.
And in fact, people were talking about, like, if you just talk to Ferguson residents,
Just talk to people. If you just talk to the people on the ground, they were telling that story.
It's in the Vice video, the woman who's saying the police harassment.
I actually wanted to mention that. So what we tried to do, and it was a little tricky because we basically didn't sleep for the first 3 weeks because the protests were going on until 4 or 5, and we were out there reporting them. And then during the day, you would get a few pressers from police and the governor and whoever, and then we would try and get that context. So we actually found the family. There's a grandmother that you saw at the end, and we found this family in Jennings, actually, not in Ferguson, and kind of followed them around for a few days and tried to get the context, in a way, with very limited time. And that's something they talked about, not so much traffic fines, but this constant harassment, the fact that every single person in this county has a story to tell about police encounters and police brutality. And I think, it's difficult and it's a balancing act all the time. But I think we all learned a lot of lessons from Ferguson. I think there's going to be a lot more, I hope there's going to be a lot more receptivity to these kinds of issues and a lot more willingness to sort of find the Fergusons where they're really happening. I actually, I mentioned this, I think on a different panel, but right around the time when Ferguson was happening, I think it was Human Rights Watch or another group put out this report on private prisons profiting off incarceration in Augusta, Georgia, which I just randomly happen to know because my husband's family is there. And I've always thought of Ferguson. I was like, oh my God, this is like Augusta. This is like, Augusta could be Ferguson. It's such a similar dynamic. And here you have this massive for-profit prison system. Nobody's talking about it. The local media is absolutely aware of it, but not really pushing it in any way. And, is it going to take another Ferguson-type moment for us to kind of wake up to this happening there and elsewhere? I don't know. I'm definitely paying a lot more attention to these things. I think a lot of reporters are.
And Holder's report does, it does say this is happening in other communities. There's no reason to think that this is not occurring in other communities.
Yeah, but it's not enough to say that it's Ferguson is everywhere. We then, as reporters, have to actually, dig into the stories and make them accountable and make them public before the Ferguson moment.
Right. So I want to talk for a second about the sort of extremes in this story. And John, I want to talk about the No Angel story, because I think there was a tendency at a certain point for people wanted to see heroes and demons in the story. And you wrote a story about Michael Brown that just was what we would call at the Missourian, where I teach, a life story. Who was this guy? What were his dreams? What were his plans? Why do you think that some of the public responded so negatively to this little phrase in the story? Michael Brown was no angel.
Yeah, well, there's various reasons. I think one reason just straight up was that we shouldn't have used the phrase. It was a misuse of the phrase on our part. So you got to kind of own up to that. I think, part of it is the kind of media culture we live in, where it's, just short snippets. And I'm sure that most, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I'm sure that there were a lot of people who probably did not get to the story until they read something about it saying no angel. And once you get in there, it's totally tainted. You cannot unsee it. It's like the Rorschach test. Once you see something in a thing, you can't unsee it. So if you read an article about the article saying the article's bad before you read it, you're not going to give it a fair chance. So I sincerely believe that if folks were to have read it without having read about it first, I believe they would have come away with a different view of it. That's just and obviously I'm biased because I wrote the thing. But yeah, so I really think that there's kind of this is what when you talk about tweeting, I still don't tweet that much, but that's one of my things that I don't like about it. You can't have a thorough, sensible conversation. You have you can use a hashtag and use a phrase, but it's one thing to say no angel, but it's another thing to put in context. Okay, here's a guy who the only fight his best friend has ever seen him got into was someone punching him and he didn't punch him back. Yet, what does that tell us about what he would do when he encounters a police officer? If he's not going to punch back a little kid, you ask yourself those questions. Is he going to? Now, obviously, as a journalist, I can't jump to those conclusions in my story because I'm not an opinion writer. But obviously, you can't have that discussion with someone on Twitter, and
right.
you can't talk in contextual. You can't. Yeah, you can cherry pick phrases of someone in one story saying Darren Wilson was a nice guy, but you don't cherry pick the quote with Mike Brown's mother saying, "Oh, he was so cool, he got along with everybody." You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's
Yep.
so yeah. I mean, it is what it is. It's the environment we're in.
Mm-hmm.
It happened, and yeah, and I think, like you said, it was kind of one of those things where it was such a divisive issue,
Right.
that you can't. That people are going to take one side extremely or the other,
Right.
and it's hard to land in the middle. And I think it permeates itself in other ways of reporting. Like, for instance, if you wrote that, and you would witness it, yeah, sure, police were stupidly pointing and using their rifles the scope in their rifle to look at protesters was just stupid. They were pointing their guns at people. But if you write that you saw a protester throw a rock at a thing, then suddenly you're, oh my goodness, you're taking the police side. No, you're reporting what you saw. I mean, you gotta have the courage and conviction to write what you see, and
That's our job, bearing
that's what you see sometimes.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? And it doesn't mean you're taking a side. But I think journalism has evolved to this point nowadays where everybody wants to have an opinion, that they just assume. And I'm not saying I don't have opinions. Yes, I do. I absolutely do. But I am a professional enough to, when I am writing my story, I don't necessarily let my opinion be what drives the story.
Right.
Per se. So
Was this one hard for you in that way? Was this one a greater challenge, Ferguson?
In
terms
Ferguson
of
in general?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of sort of the emotions you felt when you were there?
Yeah, it was somewhat difficult, but also there were other parts of it that I would say were easy because I felt like I could, a lot of the young men that I spoke with, I felt that I could develop a bond with them where, they were trusting enough to me, and they really told the story. I didn't have to inject my opinion. I just had to turn on the tape recorder and say, "What's up?" and they said it all for me. You know what I'm saying? So I didn't really have to, and yeah. So to that extent, I think that was actually fairly one of these easier parts.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question, John? When you write for the Times, do you sometimes feel like I've written for the Times, and sometimes there's the idea of who's your audience when you write for the Times? Mm-hmm. Like, do you think of who you're? Because I sometimes feel like that there's a sense of that the general readership there is predominantly a white audience, mm-hmm. and I feel that in some of the work that I've done for them, that there's a sense of translating information that seems natural to me as a person of color to a white audience. I don't know if you ever feel that.
I never thought about that. Honestly, I haven't felt it directly.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you say that, I can think about it indirectly in terms of, you'd see certain phrases used by some writers in some stories that, people are like, understand. They make a Brady Bunch reference. It's like, oh, yeah, But then I make a reference to something. It's like, oh, well, we need to change that, make it. Yeah, so to that extent, maybe on a more, like, technical level. As far as, like, a broader scale of, do I need to write a story about Mike Brown in a way that white people would understand him? That certainly wasn't going through my mind personally. I don't know if the editors who had it, that was going through their mind. I can't. And as I think back about certain things that they wanted to do to the story, to tweaks here and there, it didn't strike me that was the case. But I mean, it could very well be. That has not necessarily been my experience.
Yeah, not even on the broader levels, just in the small levels, because this has been such a thing for me about this story, is the way language has changed in these small levels, even more so than the broad levels. And I wasn't implying that, but that it was for a wide audience. But I've had that too, where just small references that it's like, oh, this is assumed knowledge for a certain group, but not necessarily for a white audience. And you see that with, I've seen that with the language in this story. To me, the most remarkable thing is the way white supremacy has come to be used more widely in place of racism, in part because the word racism implies that that there could be such a thing as reverse racism. And that's just, that's come to be a thing that people are, no, there's no such thing as reverse racism because it's a system of disadvantagement. And when you use the word white supremacy, you can't do the same thing of like, well, you're a reverse white supremacist. Well, yeah, exactly. So I think that that kind of language is, you've seen a lot of those small differences, and you see it with respectability politics, and that came up. I thought your article was fine. I totally agree with you that I think it was just an easy transition because you had the whole thing about the angel in the beginning, and so I see why it was used. And the problem is the history of the way that was used, not the way it was used in your article. And so when you bring back all these examples of saying, oh, this person was no angel, then it really does have an implication, and that's that kind of sensitivity that like now people are like to a point of maybe oversensitivity with yours, but like that kind of sensitivity to language, I think, is been one of the huge changes since Ferguson. That
I had that same reaction. We had this conversation before you got here, by the way. We're talking all about you before you got here. I wrote very early on a piece about the trial I thought was coming of Michael Brown, that his life was going to go on trial, public trial, and that he would not be here to testify for himself, that it would be a faceless jury of largely Twitter people debating, what his life was worth and what it was not worth. And what I found, and this really crossed racial lines, unfortunately, is that a great many people believe that the amount of justice you rightly have access to is dependent upon the life you've led. That equal protection should be qualified based on how we feel you've lived your life. And so did that happen to you in that way? Well, maybe you deserve for it to happen to you. And so your piece was taken in that context. And unfortunately, sometimes our first or early on engagement with social media like Twitter is when we're getting attacked. And we kind of get this idea that you really can't have full and robust conversations. You can. Absolutely. I can tell you that my life, my public life, and my evolving to be as a journalist, hopefully an intellectual, is enriched by what I get out of those engagements. And so I watched the furor around No Angel. And I sat back and here's something controversial, and I said, it wasn't. But neither was Darren Wilson. If you look at the lives that they led, how Darren Wilson policed, how, Michael Brown lived his life on a day-to-day. Neither of them were angels. But does that mean that they were to be afforded less justice? For Darren Wilson, I think the call should always be for truth and transparency. Let the chips fall where they may. Innocent, guilty, let's just get it all out here and figure it out. Because, not just Michael Brown's life, but we all deserve that. And that standard is higher for law enforcement officers. But where Michael Brown is concerned, I think there were too many people calling for him even now to be some kind of perfect martyr. They prefer Eric Garner's case. They prefer Tamir Rice because Tamir's in his 12 short years on this planet, is that angel that we have been looking for. I have said time and time again, and this is where I kind of get away from being a journalist and being an activist, is injustice is injustice no matter who it touches or when it touches them in their lives or the lives that they led up until the moment when they were touched with it. And it is no less unjust because of who they were before that moment. And so I think that I was probably one of the few voices out there saying No Angel was okay. It was what it was. What we feared, though, is that it was giving ammunition to some other, ambiguous side.
Go ahead. I'm curious to know what you think of, and sorry if I ask this question here. What about if, like, it came out, because as you have in some police shooting cases, what if Mike Brown had had prior arrests for shooting at police officers or punching a cop and stuff like that? Do you think that's relevant in our media landscape, and should it rightly change or affect people's perceptions of what happened, if that were the case?
This came up similarly the other day, where there was a case in Los Angeles, Skid Row, where a homeless man was shot. NBC produced a news story a couple days later that said he was a convicted bank robber, gun robber. He was living under an assumed name, and one of the Ferguson protesters tweeted me back and said, why would you retweet this story, and it doesn't matter, and priors do matter when you're adjudicating a case. And when you're able to sort of judge what a person may or may not have done in that circumstance, did they have a propensity to want to fight? Did they have a propensity? That stuff does matter when you're judging all of this stuff. So had it come out that he was, a gunslinging totem, yeah, it would have, as you begin to assess this case. But does it change, the facts of what, we all let it color, does it change the facts of what happened in that, say, 45-second span that he rolled up on Michael Brown and told him get his ass out the street? Does it also matter that 95% of all jaywalking tickets and citations in Ferguson were African Americans? That's context we also need. So if we're going to bring in the context, let's bring it all in. And then let the chips fall where they may.
And I would just say one point, and I think in this case, especially, it may be different from the homeless case, bringing in all that context, what Darren Wilson has done, has he had complaints, what Michael Brown has in the past, is especially more because we have no video in this one. It's not like, an Oscar Grant where he's laying on the ground handcuffed and gets shot. And because there's no video, everyone does have a certain, what actually happened between these two men, which one of them snap first, or which one of them snap, period, and I think that's where there's this natural curiosity for that. But at the same time, it is important to, I feel like in this context, people are quick to jump to the conclusion that because you say this, you're automatically ascribing a set of, facts to one person or another. And maybe it does kind of, in context, it does kind of just do that if you do that. So you have to kind of be careful when you're doing facts about their life, because maybe you are just unintentionally saying that because this person did X, they ended up doing Y in this situation.
There's that sense of false balance that you have to be really careful of are these equal? Are these people's backgrounds equally on trial? The person who was unarmed and the armed policeman? I mean, I don't think so. But the way that the information was released also, it was really interesting that first week, is the story changed as soon as that convenience store video was released, and when it was released, and information, and that convenience store where he took the cigarillos or whatever, and that seemed when that information came out, the conversation changed, and then it became more of well, who's guilty here? Is it this guy or is it this guy? And you saw this kind of thinking that became more of a sleuth thing, like a whodunit, who's guilty? And yet you had to stop yourself. I had to stop myself and be like, wait, this isn't a whodunit. There's no whodunit in institutional racism, There's no right solution. And you see that tendency to try to want to solve things in a way that don't have a to go to that kind of narrative. It's a narrative about was Mike Brown guilty or was Darren Wilson guilty? Who's the guilty party? Who's the thing? And you see that with something like Serial, which is ultimately about a white sort of journalist looking at this group of all people of color and not understanding where everyone falls in this, and yet it becomes a whodunit. There are certain questions about race that don't get asked because everything becomes focused in the who solved this crime, when the real questions are what's this race situation that I don't understand. And then going back to Mike Brown, you see very much about who it is, again, there's no one, like, is this ultimately about Darren Wilson? No, of course it's not about Darren. It is about Darren Wilson, and it is about this case, and it is about the history of St. Louis, and it is about the prison industrial system and policing for profit, and then it's also about institutional racism and the history of that. And I think it's very difficult whenever you're dealing with issues of race because you want to implicate someone. You want to find the villain when a real look at race is always going to involve self-implication as well.
Can I do that really quickly? When I came back from Ferguson, I've been covering the Eric Gardner killing in New York before, and when I came back from Ferguson, we kind of had a discussion in the newsroom, and we decided we wanted to be more consistent. We spent so much time covering these two cases. There are, in the meanwhile, so many other police killings had happened. So we were trying to find a way to sort of keep up with everything, and we launched this blog on policing in America. It's called Officer Involved, and it's a very simple sort of, we run the equivalent of like Newswire stories about.
Alicia, what's the name of it again, one more time?
Officer Involved,
okay.
Which is, the very euphemistic phrase used by police departments to say they killed somebody. But basically, we started this blog and started recording all these officer-involved killings all across the country. And very early on, one of the questions, I would pitch the story or bring it up to the morning meeting, and my editors would be, well, was he armed or not? And so based on that, we would cover it or not, which I found extremely problematic to start with. And I think St. Louis gave us a couple interesting examples of that within weeks of Mike Brown's killing. There was a guy that was killed in the city, Kajimi Powell, I think was his name, who had mental problems. He reportedly had this very small knife on him, and he was killed by police. And protesters rallied around him a little bit. There wasn't as much, it didn't build up as much as it had in the Mike Brown case. And then in October, Vonderate Myers was killed in Shaw, and he was killed by an off-duty cop, and then a gun was found on him. And so that story was kind of big for a while, and then it disappeared. And I think, to the benefits of the individual cases, of course, these things matter very much. But for us that are covering this, I think, we should be covering mental health and policing, and we should be covering why do so many kids have guns, and look at the bigger picture. And St. Louis having the murder rate that it has, one of the worst in America. That's a story too. You don't, and of course it's connected to police and it's connected to so many other things. So it becomes very difficult to then sort of pick what stories fit.
Yeah, especially in shrinking newsrooms, and that's a real problem, I think, underlying some of what happened and what continues to happen in the way stories are chosen. We do need to switch now to a Q&A because I have a feeling that there's some questions out there. I'll bet there are. One little hint I'll drop first is that 3 of the 4 people on this panel have said they want to make a documentary or they'd like to make a documentary about Ferguson, and I hoped to get to a conversation about what would that look like? What is the film that you'd make if you could? So maybe we can get at that a little bit in this Q&A. Anybody have a question?
So I know you guys have talked about your social media coverage of Ferguson, but I was wondering how you guys felt about the evolution of the conversation that was happening, or the coverage that was happening on Ferguson, because I feel like there was a lot of coverage that came out, and then there was a lot of pushback from people about the coverage that was coming out, and I was wondering how you guys felt about how other outlets reacted to that pushback as well, and even how other journalists interacted with each other, and keeping each other accountable and just talking with each other.
Before you guys answer, I just want to say from an observer, it was quite bizarre to be watching all the people on the ground with their tweets and the live streams in the middle of the night, and then things would escalate, and then there would be a press conference at 3 in the morning saying things that did not happen because I just saw them on live stream, and then in the morning seeing the national press saying exactly what was said at the press conference. It was bizarre.
So I'll start on this. I wasn't watching any of the coverage because I was in the middle of it and I was really out 24 hours, but I think I realized that afterwards. So I did see these press conferences happening, and then I would get the occasional text from my editor telling me what CNN was saying. And it was so surreal in a way. There was actually one moment on, I think it was Saturday night, when you guys saw the video at the beginning, there was a moment when we pulled up to a bus, a corrections bus. That was, there was this parking lot by a Target, which police designated as a media zone, and there was a presser there at like 3 or 4 a.m. Maybe 400 journalists in a square this big, and we were waiting for this presser, and nothing was happening, and we just got sick of it and walked away, and literally behind the building, they had all these corrections buses and all these arrests being made, like really like 20 meters away from a bunch of journalists, and nobody reported it. The day after, there was no coverage of that. We live streamed it, and then went back to the presser and actually asked about it. And so there was this very, this big disconnect. And in a way, most of the people I was interacting with were really following the story from Twitter, from live streams, not just our live streams, but protesters actually had 5, 6 different ones they were running at the same time. So depending on who you are and what you chose to follow, your understanding of what happened in Ferguson is so different. And to this day, I have conversations with friends in New York that did watch it online, on the news. And my Ferguson is so different from their Ferguson, and I really find that outstanding. And I'm hoping that maybe the documentaries that will come out and maybe some of the books that I'm assuming are going to come out on Ferguson will bridge some of that. But right now, there are really 2 different narratives about what happened there.
One of the streams or the threads that I've been listening to in this discussion is about the phenomenon of things being tried in the media. Whether the media is an arm of the justice system, as I think Goldie's kind of suggesting that. And whether the police are an arm of the justice system, which as an attorney, I don't think of it in quite the terms you were saying, Goldie. Whether justice is implicated in somebody being shot in an act of violence. So my question, I don't know whether it comes out of this or not, is how did you respond or cover the failure to indict, which I live in Chicago. I did not come down for any of Ferguson, although I was watching the protests up in Chicago. But that seemed to be the real outrage, more than the burning of the Quick Trip. The failure to indict, and then do you think that the DOJ report has got the story at last?
I think, thanks for your question. Oh, by the way, the breaking news is that the Brown family has just filed a wrongful death lawsuit. Just came across our Twitter. And so that just came up this morning. I don't believe that American media is an arm of our justice system. I think that operating at its best, it becomes a check on it. Operating at its worst, it becomes culpable to some of its weaknesses. I think when we watched the Central Park 5 documentary last evening, it was one of those shining examples of when, one, not enough questions are asked and the right questions aren't asked. And we become people taking dictation and feeding the furor and the march towards justice, and suddenly 5 young black men have had their lives stolen. The same is probably true in the Kajami Powell case, in the Vondrick Miles case. Vondrick was not innocent enough for our taste. I went through the police reports and through some of the investigative notes, and there's just no way what that off-duty police officer said happened the way that he said it happened. And maybe there was a gun, found him, I don't know, but he was not innocent enough for us. And so we stopped asking questions. And so we won't ever know what happened out on that knoll in South St. Louis that night. There aren't any protests, certainly, to bring us there. There's nobody burning a gas station to take us back there. No journalists are going to be arrested at a McDonald's to take us back to that story. And so that officer is going to go on policing in the way and manner that he was policing before, and that family has buried a young man without the facts that I think that they deserve. Is the justice system responsible? Primarily, yes. Do we have a fiduciary duty, I think, to check that? Yes. Do we fail? A lot. Do we get it right? A lot. But news audiences today are different than they were when we were coming up in St. Louis with, what was it, Channel 2-5, you know, and 2, 4, and 5, and if Channel 11 came to your house, or Channel 9. And, you know, there are 500 channels now, and people have choices, and they tend to choose those things that check with their narrative. And if you don't, they turn to something else that does. And so audiences, the media landscape is different in terms of its diversity of choices. I mean, you used to go to the movie theater at Northwest Plaza. There were 2 movie theaters. Now there are like 24 in one location. You got choices. And you choose those things that check with your life, your cultural lens. That has both had a positive and a negative impact on how news is gathered, news gathering in this country, and the way that we tell stories. And thus, you know, a Fox News has got millions of viewers every night, and they don't have a, they don't feel like they have a duty to get it right most of the time. Same is true as MSNBC. You know, they don't always have to feel like they have a duty to get right. And so, are we an arm of the justice system? No. At our best, we check them. At our worst, we're culpable.
Right there. Yep. Go ahead.
Whenever I watch a cop show on TV, and I have to admit, I do watch them, things like Cops and Cops Reloaded. And whenever they stop a suspect, there's this supposition that the suspect is a career criminal. And so the questions are, you know, what have you been arrested for? And also, when's the last time you used drugs? As if this has anything to do with what they're being stopped for. And in a similar vein, whenever I watch a prison show like Lock Up or Lock Up Raw, and you have all these people with the tattoos, you know, but there's never any discussion of what kind of services have you offered this person who probably comes from a really terrible background of abuse, and how is his incarceration going to make him any better?
Did you have a question, sir?
Sort of a question, or I would like some comments about why do you think this is done? Maybe the answer is pretty obvious, but.
Well, I think that one thing that people lack an appreciation for is how humiliating it is to be stopped by a police officer, and you know, not just stopped and given a speeding ticket, but stopped and frisked and handcuffed and whatnot. You know, thankfully I've never been handcuffed, but I have been stopped when out reporting because someone called in the report of a suspicious person. I was wearing a pink shirt at the time, so I guess I was looking real suspicious. But and one of the things in the DOJ report that I haven't really seen much coverage of, and probably won't get much coverage, that was most startling to me, was a cop pulling up in front of a guy who was at a bus stop and says, "Get the fuck over here," and you know, cursed at him. And the guy's like, he was waiting for the bus. He's like, "Who, me?" He looked at him, he was like, "Who, me?" He walked up there. Cop said, you know, show me your fucking ID, or who are you, or you know, the guy showed it to him. The cop, you know, told him to get the fuck out of my face and made him like go back to the bus stop. Now that people won't look at that as much because he wasn't arrested. Like, you know, there's that one story of the guy who was lost his job because he was arrested, because that makes for, you know, something we can all relate to. They, oh my goodness, he lost his job because he was arrested. But how humiliating is it for this man sitting there waiting for the damn bus and a cop to come and tell him to come up and then tell him to get the fuck out of his face after you called him over? You know, and I think what you see on Cops is kind of speaks to one of the things that the Justice Department talks to. It all starts with how you treat people. If you treat them like human beings, you don't talk to someone like that, you know, and someone who's waiting for a bus. And so, I mean, I think those are definitely the things that we need to look at. You know, it doesn't always have to be an arrest or someone getting shot or whatnot. It can be the very simple, everyday things of how you say hello to someone or whatnot.
I had one quick comment and then a question. First, it's really interesting, I think, in hearing about this idea that, in talking about the disproportionate response of the police to the protests early on, that I couldn't help but think about Birmingham and police dogs and fire hoses, and that when we're talking about a civil rights movement, that sometimes what it takes to capture people's attention is that disproportionate response. And that was, in the case of Birmingham, as opposed to, say, Albany, Georgia, it required this extreme, horrifying response from the police, worse than what we'd seen in other places, to get the attention of the media, to get this sort of national attention. And so I just thought it was interesting to hear you talking about it in a way that really reminded me of that, sort of from a historical perspective. But my question is actually about this, what Catherine, you were talking about at the beginning, this sort of, this taking sides and the way that we interpret the information differently depending on our perspectives. And, you know, we're all here in this room talking about this, but how do we, as journalists, as storytellers, how do we break through that line? How do we access and have that conversation with the people who are changing the channel, as you said, Goldie, because they're not hearing what they want to hear? Like, how do you bridge that to another side of the story, to people who have a certain perspective that's maybe not the same as the one in this room?
Great question.
I think that's a really difficult challenge, and I just wonder if anyone has any insight on that.
I think it's a great question and a very difficult challenge, as you said. I don't know. I think one of the things that's missing so much in our coverage is the capacity to create empathy. And so regardless of your personal experience and regardless of your political opinion on something, there's something we should all be able to connect to and relate to. And so to go back actually to the documentary question, we're trying to make a documentary out of Ferguson and out of footage we got in the early days, but that does that. That is not just about the protests and tear gas that everybody has seen, but that is telling the story and telling it in a way that hopefully will grab the attention of people that are kind of like checked out or have heard enough about Ferguson and don't care anymore. And I think an interesting way to look at it is just, look at families and look at lives. So we have this family in Jennings where, actually sounds very similar to your family, like almost every man in that family has been killed or is in jail or has definitely a history of encounters with police. But, tell it through the women of the family, which I'm not saying is the only way to do it, but I think is it's a way that can help build that empathy. Like everybody can relate to a mother, to a grandmother, saying it's very difficult to raise African-American children in this neighborhood. It's, in a way, it's a very radical statement, it's a very polemical statement, but made in that way, it's something that we can perhaps relate to more. So that's one way we're trying. I think it's, it's a question we should be asking ourselves all the time, but it's also something that we should, I struggle with. I cover a lot of other things in addition to this, do international news, and something I cover quite a bit of is actually migration stories, wherever they may happen. And people are so absolutely checked out. Every other week I'm writing about 500 migrants in the Mediterranean drowning. I'm from Italy, where stories like this happen every other day, and people are just completely detached. There's no personal story, they're just numbers, people drowning, it happens all the time. So to me, the challenge as a journalist is how do we get these stories to the audience and make them care about this? And I think actually technology can be very helpful in that sense. We do a lot of live streams. We've also, we didn't get to talk about this, but we've also tested a VR documentary at a New York protest for Eric Garner. It was the Millions March, and we filmed the whole protest and produced a 3D documentary about it. And it's a little weird, and I also have a lot of ethical questions about it, but you basically put these goggles on, and if you've never been to a protest, you're suddenly inside one. So you turn around 360, and you see police there and protesters there, and it feels very real. So I think if we can use that technology to build empathy, if we can put one of these cameras on a boat crossing from Libya to Italy and make people see what it feels like, then I think we're onto something there.
I have a question, and maybe I think you started to answer it actually, but after the cigarillos, after the No Angel controversy, I mean, it was sort of fascinating that the year ended with American Sniper, which is very much like a narrative about someone who's self-consciously no angel. The movie did not try to make him into an angel. It begins by him killing a child. And yet the kind of rich outpouring of sympathy that you got from that movie, it was disheartening to see that coming after the things that had happened earlier in the year. But I wonder if there's something there that can sort of help us think about the documentary question, and whether there's something one can do as a documentarian that one can't necessarily do as a journalist that can help push past that kind of barrier.
Well, you know, I think documentary filmmaking is journalism. I think it's long-form journalism. Journalism is reporting and telling the story, and so is making of a documentary. I'm a former Marine. It's how I got out of our situation. The dynamic that we set up among our societal heroes, police officers, men and women who are members of the military veterans, rank right up there. And we are more conditioned to make allowances for them when they do bad deeds in the service of what we think is our greater good. We are more ready to give them breaks, discounts when they do wrong than we are, say, the used car salesman on the corner. We like heroes. We like idols as a society. I haven't lived in any other country, so I can only speak to this American society that I reside in. And so that's the hero complex. He or she can really do no wrong. There was a lot more wrong with Chris Kyle than showed up on that screen. But if you talk about it out loud in the wrong place, you know, you're liable to get verbally attacked over how could you say this about this hero. And so that's what's really at work there. And some of it was at work in Ferguson. Somebody had to be the good guy, and that wasn't going to be Michael Brown. And so Darren Wilson was held up in many quarters as a hero, as someone who got discounts on prior behavior because of how we treat our American heroes. And so I think there are lots of threads between this case and American Sniper, lots of threads between this and other cases like it.
We have time for one more question over here.
Hi, I'll make this quick. I know earlier you were talking about how it was hard to have a conversation on Twitter, and seeing how times are changing from, instead of just writing a story, putting out a story and maybe a angry letter or email being written where then the publication has time to discuss an answer coming back out. Like on Twitter, when you're putting out stories or putting out somewhat of a personal opinion on something that's happened, I think we see a lot of like trolling happening, or people responding to you or trying to find a way to, I guess, suppress your voice with other facts and things like that. So I just wanted to know, for those of you, like you said, with Vice, you do a lot of online footage and things like that, how you kind of draw the line between facilitating a healthy discussion and proving your point, and then like giving into trolling and being in a public argument where then your words are taken out of context.
I don't respond on Twitter. I just don't. I've gotten into one Twitter beef ever, and that was short-lived. But I just don't. Well, I'd say a couple things. One, the problem with Twitter that I think people don't realize, like, honestly, when I'm out in the field reporting, I am, what's going on here or there? People are constantly, and you're missing what's going on in front of you. So, I mean, honestly, I just don't, and maybe I'm just not good enough at multitasking, but I just feel like I don't have the time. How can I sincerely give someone my attention and get them to trust me while I'm on my phone every 2 seconds? You know, so that's one thing. And two, a problem that I have with the media culture today, it's a lot of a me society, and I feel like having a public argument on Twitter makes the story more about me than about the story, and I don't like to do that. I'm glad I'm okay just being a byline. I want my characters to speak for themselves. You know, the folks who I interview. You know, like I know a lot of times if I get media requests, and this is one of my former journalism mentors. I told him I just don't feel comfortable going on TV talking about my story. He said, well, why don't you tell the producers, hey, well, can you bring my source on there with me? And I'm like, that's a good idea. You know, I did that once with a short story I did in Detroit, a radio station. I said, well, can you bring her on there because she's the real story? You know, and it's like. And so that, I mean, to get to your point about Twitter, I mean, I just feel, I personally, I'm not saying it's wrong if people do it. I'm not saying you can't facilitate healthy discussion, but I just feel sometimes those discussions often end up being much more about the people involved than the subject matter itself. That's my problem with it.
I want to thank our panel for coming. John, for coming back. Thank you very much.
To the children out here, because we're seeing what's happening in this generation. We're seeing things that we don't need to be seeing.
When all this stuff happened with Mike Brown in Ferguson, how were people in this community, in this neighborhood, reacting to that?
Since the Mike Brown incident and now this incident, it's going to be a big deal. It's going to be big. It's going to be big.
It was very hard to raise African American males in this community, especially with the police harassment.
We all Michael Brown, Jason. We're not just Michael Brown, it's a movement. We tired. We need to stand up.
So, Alicia and Goldie, I want you two to help provide us with a timeline of the early days of the media coverage of what was happening in Ferguson. Antonio French has talked about, Antonio French is an alderman, St. Louis alderman, was one of the first people there who was vining at the scene. Talk about what happened to those images and sort of the timeline of when the national media and then the international media started to descend.
You know, there really was a TikTok that I think most people weren't really aware of, but I saw a graph that hit Twitter that sort of crystallized it for me, that showed me the context of how social media erupted first, and then cable newsers took it on, and then print journalists sort of made their way into Ferguson. That Saturday, I guess it's around 4 o'clock Eastern time, 3 o'clock Central. I'm at home in Atlanta, and I'm on Twitter, and my family back home in Ferguson and St. Ann, they're beginning to tweet about this kid. And at the time, the news was, he's 17, 10 shots, unarmed in the back. That's the headline that I'm getting at, you know, my time in Atlanta. When I tune in, I start to see these pictures, videos vines come in. First time I'd ever seen a vine in my life, I have to tell you. And I'm watching these short videos come out of Ferguson, and the young man is still on the ground. And there are a number of very early voices in this. I sent the first hot note, and at the time I'm working for MSNBC, but I sent the first hot note to both CNN and MSNBC around 5 o'clock Eastern time, 4 o'clock your time here. No one responded. CNN was silent. MSNBC rang in that night, says, we've got a local affiliate, local story, you know, maybe we'll talk about it.
And there's robbery, and that, of course, really angered protesters. So that night, we saw again more violent protests and some looting, and of course, the day after that, the day after that, a state of emergency and a curfew were put into place. So that's kind of the timeline of the first week or so. But for me, I would say that Wednesday is really the day that put it on the map for most national media, and I think the sad thing about that is that really what I think did it is the fact that 2 journalists were arrested and then journalists were tear gassed. Because protesters have been getting arrested and getting tear gas for the 3 days prior to that, and nobody was really paying a whole lot of attention.
Yeah. John, when did you get there?
Well, my situation was a little bit different. I mean, in that I that Monday, I actually had to take off for a family obligation for a couple of days, so I was kind of out of the loop. One of my colleagues, I think the Monday was the first day we had a story, so it would be Sunday night into Monday morning. My opinion on what actually got the media interested was the burning of the Quick Trip, and I think that had that not happened, then Mike Brown would just be another footnote of the long list of young black men who've been killed in St. Louis, unfortunately, and unfortunately it did take the burning of the Quick Trip to get people's attention. And yeah, so as I said, my colleague was there. I think she had come down from Chicago on Monday. I was back home on Wednesday evening, and I worked from home, kind of, working some sources and stuff by phone while I had two of my colleagues, and we're in St. Louis, we're in Ferguson at the time. And then I eventually came down that the first night of the curfew, which I was believed to be the Saturday after it was shot, so about a week later, was the first time I was actually on the ground there.
So the local media at this point, early on, were already there, yes? Did you get a sense of surprise about what was happening in Ferguson among the local media? Because in reading the Justice Department report, you hear about problems that have been in Ferguson for a long time. And, without knowing much about, haven't had a chance to look into the depth of the reporting by the St. Louis media about the problems in Ferguson with police harassment and arrests and this revenue generating system that they had of arrests. I'm wondering what you saw of the local media early on in the coverage.
What we saw in the DOJ report yesterday has been a way of life in St. Louis since my grandparents migrated there just after the turn of the century. That there has always been what I have called an American apartheid that was enforced by law enforcement, by restrictive housing covenants, sundown towns, the social fabric of St. Louis has not evolved all that much. Local press has been aware largely of the conditions, but not reported to any significant extent over the years. This was their story to break, and they never did. And so I find us culpable as journalists in allowing this kind of condition to persist. And when the story next week, they did talk about it that Sunday, but the tweets kept coming. I had a hard time shutting down my app that night because people were still talking. The rage was building, and by the time the following day on Sunday came, MSNBC ran a short package in its noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock hours, its news hours, but no one else was saying a word nationally until Sunday night. Just before sundown, you're seeing brand new vines, and by this time, Antonio French is on the ground. And we're sending, his vines are starting to get into newsrooms around the country. And I say to MSNBC, we got to talk to this guy. He's not from Ferguson, drawing the lines. By the time sundown was coming in St. Louis, and you're starting to see what these vines are looking like, that the crowd is young, the crowd is agitated. There's no leadership, no activist leadership on the ground. The NAACP is nowhere to be found. Things are about to pop off. So my third hot note goes in. I know we've got a local affiliate, but we need to have better eyes on the ground. Unrest is coming. MSNBC would not send anyone. So I got the NAACP and a local business leader to fly me into St. Louis Monday morning. And I became the first national reporter on the ground because no one else thought it was such a great story. By Monday night, we were live.
Right. Alicia, were you there right about the same time? Did you arrive?
I actually got on Wednesday. I had to push quite a bit
to push.
There.
Move your mic up. Right. Thanks.
I've been following this since probably about Sunday also, but we cover international news and national news when they're really big national news. We're a fairly small news organization and have very limited resources. But we have been covering protests and social movements all over the world. We kind of made a name for that kind of coverage. And so by the time Tuesday came, I was really telling my editor, there is no way we can not cover this. This is in St. Louis. It's like 2 hours away from New York. We have to be there. And so they finally they sent me alone. And I'm actually a staff writer. I don't normally work on the video division at Vice. And then that Wednesday is actually, I think, the day that really marked a tipping point for the media. That afternoon, Wes from the Washington Post and Ryan from the Huffington Post were arrested at McDonald's, the infamous McDonald's. Actually watched them get arrested. It was the most absurd thing ever. And then that night, Al Jazeera got tear gas while live. And so the day after, Vice sent down a whole crew. Everybody else did. It went from basically no coverage, a few national correspondents, local reporters, independent media, and then everybody. The day after, I was sitting next to Chris Hayes at a press conference. And that day, actually, it's interesting because that's when they moved control of the protests over to the Missouri Highway Patrol. And that Thursday night was actually extremely peaceful. It was tons of people out, hundreds of people. It was really a beautiful moment, actually. That's when people thought the protests might turn into something positive. It was a great night. You could see some of the national reporters perhaps a bit disappointed there was no tear gas that night. But overall, it was actually a great night. And then the Friday, so the day after that, Ferguson PD released a video with the alleged robbery, possibly incriminating Mike Brown in this.
Jess Sperry is a reporter at Vice News, where she has covered a variety of social justice issues, including policing, criminal justice, labor, and immigration. She was one of the first national reporters on the front lines of the Ferguson protests and has returned to Missouri several times since then, and has covered the movement for police accountability as it has spread across the country. And on the end is Goldie Taylor, a veteran journalist, opinion writer, and cable news contributor. She's worked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, for MSNBC as a political analyst, and in recent years has written dozens of guest op-ed columns for The Daily Beast, Salon, Essence, AJC, Creative Loafing, St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It's a long list, Goldie. Goldie grew up in East St. Louis, went to school in Ferguson and St. Anne, and moved around the greater St. Louis area. Her film 89 Blocks about East St. Louis is in post-production. She also spent some time in Ferguson last year. So let's begin with a Vice video. Bring us all back right away.
Gunshot. Today's Monday evening. This is the first night that the National Guard has arrived in Ferguson. Press journalism.
Hey, let's get going.
Down here. So they won't talk to us. They told us to go back to the beginning of the line.
Keep going.
Can you tell me what you've seen tonight? It would help everyone understand why you guys are doing it.
They'll talk to you up there, ma'am.
A lot of people here are telling us they're constantly harassed by police. They're pulled over for any reason, given tickets for any reason or no reasons, and they're just tired and frustrated. Do you see that, or do you agree with it?
No, I don't see it, but people that I've talked to have been supportive and appreciative of our work and trying to protect them and save them.
We're not getting arrested, we're getting a ride from police officers, and we're going back to police headquarters. Just saw a guy that looked like he had been cuffed get into this van over here, and we're now seeing another guy who's shirtless, wearing just shorts, and police are searching him.
I need you to shut your camera off, man. We're going to go through here. All right, go ahead and shut your camera off because you can't be filming this, okay?
Just put it down.
Yes, I'm going to escort him up here. Go ahead and put your camera down or shut it off for me, ma'am. All right, that's per my command.
A cop just killed a guy in front of my apartment. When I seen Big Mike got shaken up, nigga had to tweet that site. If you seen that night, they ran in the QT, burned it down. West Florissant, looting, cops posted in my street. 20 niggas deep, guns pointed, and my people still gather beautifully.
Instead of getting answers, we're getting shot at. People are still getting hurt by the police.
Look at this shit. Look at this. I'm suing their ass. Who was it? City, county, the safety patrol, all of their ass.
Well, Thursday, there was, we talked about being transparent. And people trusted that. And I meant that when I said it. And it's taken us a couple of days to get back to Thursday and that trust.
It's not fair to the kids.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Reed. I'm a faculty member in print and digital news and teach at the Missouri and have been part of boats for 4 years. And this morning we're talking about Ferguson. No recent news story has better illustrated the power of images and social media to influence opinion and move people to action than Ferguson. What began as a local story quickly became national then international news as people in Ferguson used Twitter and Vine and Reddit to tell each other in the world what had happened to Mike Brown. The story went viral, and it wasn't just about the 90 seconds of fatal interaction between Mike Brown and Darren Wilson, or about the hours that Brown's body lay in the street. It blew the lid off tensions between police and the people they're sworn to serve and protect, and exposed the fraught relationship between black communities and white-dominated government institutions, like the police department in Ferguson, like others all over the country. The story tapped deeply into an undercurrent of anger and frustration toward a criminal justice system that seems stacked against black people, especially young black men. It revealed to citizens how militarized even small-town police departments have become with the help of the federal government. It validated different things for different people. For people raised with a fear of law enforcement and frustration with being targeted day after day, what happened in Ferguson was more of the same and the last straw. For others, Ferguson was just more evidence that black men need suppressing, and thank God for the police. What people thought about what happened to Mike Brown and Tamir Rice and Eric Garner and Rodney King depends on a multitude of factors. Sometimes watching on Twitter, it looked like a national consciousness raising about race in America, or as if nothing ever changes. Citizen journalists, especially live streamers, people working for new media or companies, mainstream media organizations, anyone with a smartphone, contributed to providing hundreds of perspectives. Some news organizations tried to create context for the chaos, barely able to keep up with the speed and the intensity of the news. So perhaps it's now up to documentary filmmakers to bring together not just the what happened and the why, but even more important, the what now. So let me introduce our panel. John arrives just in the nick of time, fresh from Ferguson, Missouri. Let me start here with Miriam Bale, who is a freelance writer who's written for the New York Times, the Daily News, IndieWire, Sight and Sound, Film Comment, and many other outlets. She is also a film programmer and has organized film series and festivals, has a background in documentary film production, and is working on a book about black film in the age of Obama. John Eligon has been a reporter for the New York Times for 10 years and is currently stationed in Kansas City, covering 6 states in the Midwest. He writes on a variety of topics, from politics to urban issues to rural life. He is a graduate of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and John covered Ferguson extensively.